I have found that in recreating events with great drama and great emotion, it's really hard to remember time. People lose sense of time.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard Podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. I'm also the founder of Long Reads and co-founder of the podcasting company Ursa. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. Today, I'm excited to welcome author, journalist, and frequent storyboard contributor Kim Cross. She's the New York Times bestselling author of books including What Stands in a Storm, The Stall House, and In Light of All Darkness. Her stories have appeared in the New York Times, Outside, Bicycling, Garden & Gun, and ESPN, among other publications. She also teaches feature writing for Harvard Extension School, and she's a lifelong athlete, having competed in at least 10 sports nationally or internationally, including water skiing, sprint triathlon, off-road triathlon, and 24-hour adventure racing. She's a certified mountain bike coach and loves fly fishing. This was a great conversation. We get into a lot of questions about her process for reconstructing narratives. I'm particularly a fan of how transparent she is about this process with both readers and students, since she also teaches classes in narrative nonfiction. She most recently wrote for Storyboard about how journalists can organize their work so they can be prepared for the fact-checking process. All of her articles, books, and stories are in the show notes for this episode, so be sure to check that out. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Kim Cross. Kim Cross, it's great to have you here. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
You have covered a wide range of topics over the years, but to start things out, I wanted to dive into some of your stories about cycling. What is it about cycling that you gravitate to as both as a person and as a journalist?
So it's funny. For most of my life, I never considered sports writing. And then at some point in the middle of my career, I realized that I know a lot about sports because I was an athlete. And why could I not write about that? And so mountain biking and cycling is just something that my whole family is involved in it. So we run across a lot of story ideas. It's very natural to write about for me. And I think I see a lot of metaphors for life in cycling. And so it's fun. It doesn't feel like work when I'm writing about cycling, usually.
Yeah, and you also coach. You're a mountain bike coach, right?
That's right. I coach skills. So not so much the endurance part of cycling, but how to do a wheel lift, how to do a wheelie, how to corner, that sort of thing.
Any correlation to how you teach writing and how you teach mountain biking?
It's so funny because I was thinking about that. And I think the answer is yes, because with cycling, there are some really highly technical, nuanced skills, and you have to break them down. For example, a wheel lift isn't just one move. It is a compression, an explosion, and then a slight encouragement of the bar. And so if you just tell someone to just lift the wheel, it often doesn't go well. But if you can break it down into steps that form the bigger process, then it tends to go better. And so I think I approach teaching feature writing in that way and teaching narrative. I try not to assume that the writer knows even what a scene is, for example. So I try to break it down into elements, and then I think it's more understandable for someone who's new to the concept.
My colleagues at Ursa, Disha Filia and Donnie Walton, talk a lot on their podcast about propulsion and storytelling. And I think a lot about, some of these stories that you've written about cyclists. And there's like an actual physical propulsion where you're physically on a bike. Do you find that to be helpful in terms of coming at a story, or am I reading too much into that connection?
That's a great question. I've never thought about it in terms of that term and that concept, but I do think about momentum and pacing a lot in my writing. And I think that just like cycling, you don't want to just go one speed. It depends on the terrain. You have to sometimes push really hard and then take a recovery interval. And with narrative, I think that if you are just going, all out full speed, you can really tire the reader. And so I try to build in little breaks for maybe a moment of exposition to catch your breath after a dramatic scene. And I think that the result is, I don't know, the reader is pulled through the story. I just think that the result is the reader naturally flows through the story.
Well, let's take a specific example here because just this past fall, you published a story for bicycling called The Alchemists. And could you tell us a little bit about that story and how it came together?
Sure. So I have to give credit for the story idea to my editor, Leah Flickinger, who is features editor or features director, I think, at Bicycling. And she and I have been working together for at least 10 years. And we've worked together on some of my favorite stories. And she came to me as the Taliban was taking over Afghanistan and said, I hear that women cyclists are having to evacuate in an emergency situation because of the Taliban. And I think this is a really important story we need to tell. And at the time, I was working on the Polyclass book, a book about a child kidnapping and murder. And I said, I can't take on anything else. This book has my full attention. And she said, something that you wait your whole career to hear. She said, but this feels like a Kim Cross story. Would you please take a look? And so I said, okay, I'll take a look. And I made some calls and I found two really compelling characters and thought, oh, I can't say no to this. I have to, it was a story not just about cycling, but about women's rights and about women helping other women. So there was this constellation of women outside of Afghanistan who were working together to try to make it possible for these women in Afghanistan to get out safely. So I started reporting it, and I have to admit, I couldn't fit the Taliban and a child kidnapping and murder in my brain at the same time. And when I wrote the story, it just wasn't good enough. And my didn't have enough brain power for both. And so I knew that when I turned it in, and we ended up sort of, letting it sit for a while. And I felt enormously guilty about this. I felt like I was letting my editor down, and I was letting the women down who had helped me. And it sat for about 2 years. And in that time, the story sort of changed. Initially, it had been focused on the evacuation. And then after the evacuation kind of became old news, then it called for a total rewrite and a refocusing on what was lost when these women had to leave their country. And it was this legacy that they had built. They, as teenage girls, had convinced their culture to change its mind about the fact that women were not allowed to ride bicycles. And they did it in a really lovely way, not by, opposing the culture, but by recruiting men as their allies and having conversations and saying, it's not just about a sport. It's actually this vehicle for emancipation. It's going to help girls get to school. If more girls don't have to walk to school, if they can get there on a bike faster, more girls are going to get an education. Women might be able to get a wider variety of jobs if they can ride to work. And then from there, they put on the first co-ed cycling race in Afghan history and created the first co-ed cycling team. So it wasn't even just for women. It was this beautiful co-ed thing, but the women were the leaders. And so I wanted to really focus on what was lost. And so in a way, the, being late on the story, I think worked in its favor because it had time to marinate, and it changed into something, I think, more evergreen and more meaningful, I hope.
I'm curious how you first connected with the subjects of the story. Was that through your editor? And how did your editor find the story?
I think that she was plugged into what was happening in the news and basically said, can you go find a story? And normally this would be very hard without being on the ground in Afghanistan, but I knew Shannon Galpin, who is an incredible woman, a National Geographic explorer. I knew of her work because she was one of the women who helped support the Afghan women that were trying to get a cycling team together. And I knew of her work, and she is an amazing human rights activist. And I figured she would know some characters. And so I reached out to her, and Shannon was a key person throughout this whole story. She helped me identify the right characters. She knew what I needed, and then she helped me connect with them. And I was able to interview Rehana, and her family were just evacuating, or I think they had just evacuated. They had just landed at a safe house in Pakistan when I interviewed her the first time, and we were able to do it on Zoom. And Rehana has great English skills, and I was able to talk to her in English, and she was able to translate for her mother and her family. I also had Zakia, who had already been living in Germany. This is Rehana's sister. And Rehana was able to translate for Zakia, who also speaks some English, but Rehana is a little bit more fluent. And so that worked out really well. And then for Zara, she might have already landed in Sweden by the time I got to interview her a bit later. And I hired a translator who helped me conduct that interview.
And so all of this is done remotely?
100% remote. I was never able to travel for the story.
And so in a situation like that, how do you approach a story like this where you have these vivid scenes?
Well, I think it's kind of my sweet spot. I call it a reconstructed narrative, where you have to reconstruct scenes that, as a reporter, you are not able to witness. And it starts with, often it starts with this sequence that I call interviewing for narrative. And I did a piece about this for Storyboard because I wanted to break it down for my writing students. But it starts with some really open-ended questions. You have to first identify your character. And once you identify the character, you have to then ask really open-ended questions to understand, like, well, what happened? What were the main beats of the story? What happened? How did it affect you? How did it begin? How did it go? How did it end? And then I tighten it down and start working on a timeline. And so I think about pivotal moments and defining moments. And these are my terms for lack of finding a better one. So I've sort of made them up. But I think of a pivotal moment as a moment when something happens, usually externally to the character, that changes what happens next. There's a cause and effect relationship between that pivotal moment and something they choose to do next, or something that happens to them next. A defining moment is more internal. It's like an aha moment when the character realizes something, and that realization causes them to change the course of action. So I try to identify those, and then I start structuring them into a timeline, because I think that even though the story doesn't need to be sequenced in chronological order, I need a timeline so I can refer to flashbacks in an accurate way and flash forwards. And I then start building into that timeline external events to the narrative that might give the reader some sense of time and place. It might be an external event that happened, a big news event that people remember. And when readers are in a narrative, often dates just kind of don't mean anything. But if you give them a news event, it evokes that time. So if you say, it was the time when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, people will automatically imagine a scene almost in black and white in an earlier time. So then I go back and I start reporting for scene, which is a process that looks a little bit more like interrogating a witness on the stand, because you're going, wait. So you reached for the doorknob. Did the door open out or did it open in? And when you walked through it, did you first look to the right or to the left? What did you see if you looked to the right? What did you see if you looked to the left? And you slow them down and walk them through an event step by step, and have to tease out things that it might not occur to the character to tell you, or maybe they weren't even remembering as they are thinking about the event, but you have to tease that out in order to build out the scene. So you have to almost use your imagination to imagine what might be there, and then fact check your imagination, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How do you prepare Rehana for this interrogation as you come in? What do you tell her?
Well, by the time we get to the interrogation phase, that's like the third or fourth or fifth or later call. That doesn't happen right off the bat. I talked to my characters many, many times. And with Rehana, we did a lot of communicating through text because she used WhatsApp, and she sent me a lot of photos and video that she had captured as she was evacuating. And this is really useful because those photos and videos contain dialogue and details and things that I can then ask about. For example, I think one of the scenes with Talib soldiers riding motorbikes carrying a rocket-propelled grenade over one shoulder, I'm pretty sure that came from either a photo or a video that she had taken on her phone as she's, driving down the street in the back of her family's car looking out the window. So I try to use visuals that might be captured by the characters in the scene as much as possible, because I have found that in recreating events with great drama and great emotion, it's really hard to remember time. People lose sense of time, and often these photos and videos are time stamped. And so you can put them on a particular day. So, for example, the opening scene, I was thinking, where do I start this story? And I asked Rihanna, do you remember the last ride you went on in Afghanistan? She said, oh, yes, it was, when was it? And she said it was the day before. And I was able to get a photo that she had taken with a friend from that day to confirm, oh, yeah, this is the date. And then in that, I could see what she was wearing. And I could see what was in the background. You could see people loading things into trucks. You could see a little bit of the road and the fact that it went through a canyon. I asked her what road it was. And then I went on Google Earth and looked, and I followed the road through the canyon. And I was able to see a little bit of the landscape she was literally riding through in a way that might not have occurred to her to describe it to me. So it's this combination of imagining what might be, looking for tools to then fill in those gaps, using existing documented sources to inform your questions. It's just this, I don't know, it's almost like detective work, and it's really fun.
Could you read the opening so we can talk through some of that?
Sure. The day before the Taliban trammeled her freedom, a young woman went for a bike ride. She wore pants and a long-sleeved shirt under a sky blue cycling jersey. Her ponytail flew behind her like a flag, free of the hijab she usually wore and tucked into her helmet. Her smile was shy, but also bold, with a pop of red lipstick. Rehana Mohammadi was 18 years old, a new member of the Afghan national cycling team. She lived and trained in Bamiyan, a small and peaceful city in the rugged heart of Afghanistan. On this 20-mile ride, she was thinking about her next big race, 3 weeks away in Pakistan. She hoped to raise her country's flag in her first international victory. Riding a Team Issue mountain bike, Rehana sailed down a 2-lane ribbon of road through a desert canyon with crumbling walls. Behind her, in a valley framed by peaks, were the ancient cliffs of Bamiyan. The city was known for the Bamiyan Buddhas, 2 statues carved into a cliff. Pedaling out of the city, Rehana felt a mounting gravity. The air was still and heavy with dust. Such weather made the old women whisper, something bad is going to happen. Locals were gathering in the streets, shoving parcels into trucks. As Rehana rode past, some glanced up and noticed a young woman pedaling a bicycle through the desert. You're crazy, they cried in Dari, the native tongue. The Taliban are very close. It was August 14th, 2021. On TV screens across the world, maps of Afghanistan showed districts falling to the Taliban as the U.S. withdrew troops that had occupied the country since 2001. The center of the country was a bullseye of freedom, and in that oasis was Bamiyan, an island of peace in a sea of war, shrinking in the rising tide. Outside Rehana's central province, great cities were under siege. 24 capitals had fallen in a matter of days. Diplomas and buildings were burning. Stray bullets were landing in children. They will kill you, people on the roadside shouted. Don't go on. Rehana pedaled harder. Her older sister, Zakia, had fought for this. This was a right that, only a decade before, did not exist in Afghanistan, one of the last countries in the world where women were forbidden to ride a bicycle.
Wow. So was this opening always the way you had opened the story, even the 2 different drafts?
Yes, it was always the opening because I wanted to show, I think there's something poignant about the last ride and how people were reacting to her and the fact that she didn't turn around. She kept riding. Incentive of wanting to be ready for the race was even more powerful than the fear she felt.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
And what was it like as you came back? Because then with the newer version of the story, it was a follow-up with their families essentially scattered all over in new homes. What was it like coming back to them, and what did you find?
Well, I'll say that for the first draft, it still was about a year of following them before I turned the story in. And I was writing it as I was trying to write the polyclass book. And so I had been in touch with them throughout that year, and I would check in from time to time and say, have you, are you still in Pakistan? What's next? And I followed as they were trying to figure out what country they were going to land in. It took some months. I can't remember how many months they were in the safe house, but it was some time. And they didn't know when or where they were going to be able to live. And so I was interested in that uncertainty and how everyone was handling it. And it was interesting, too, to hear from Zakia, who was sort of waiting in Germany, going, when am I going to see my family? And so when they had the reunion, I believe I talked to them shortly after that, but also there was a film crew. There was a German law firm that had helped them get visas and do all of the paperwork necessary to get moved to Germany. And the law firm had done this pro bono, and they had sent a film crew to film the reunion, and they had done some interviews there. And so I was able to write some scenes based on the moment that they flew into each other's arms. And there were little bits of dialogue there. But after that, then I just got so subsumed by my book that some months went by, I think, before I touched base. And every time this happens, you just feel such pressure, and you feel like you're letting people down. And I just feel such anxiety even thinking about the story. At some point, it's hard to even open the draft and look at it because it produces so much anxiety. But they never lost patience with me, and I am so grateful for that. I'm sure there were times that, I felt particularly bad because Shannon was working to raise money to try to continue evacuating other girls. And the story didn't come out when it most would have helped her do that. And I just felt horrible. And I apologized and just felt like, oh gosh, I'll understand if you never want to speak to me again. But, to her credit, she understood and gave me some grace and didn't give up. And so I think when I went back, I was able to get the longer tale of the story. And what I've learned from doing narratives, many of which take years for me to place or to finish, I've learned that the long arc is almost always better and more nuanced than the short arc. And so I have learned to be patient with stories when they aren't ready in time, or when I, for some reason, can't finish them in time. I try not to give up on them because the long arc always has more insight to share. And if I had finished it when we had planned for me to finish it, it would have had a happier ending, and that happy ending would have been a little bit false. Because when they landed in Germany, Rihanna was very happy, and it looked like they had a great future, and she still had dreams of racing. But then when I came back later, it was a different ending because she had been there long enough to realize that, well, not everyone is thrilled and welcoming to refugees. Oh, it's hard for a refugee to get a job. And she was missing Bamiyan, even though she didn't have to cover her hair and dress in a certain way that she was required to in Afghanistan. She did not feel as free as she felt riding there, in pants and a long sleeve shirt with her friends. And I think that is a bigger, more nuanced truth and a better ending, even though it wasn't a happy ending. Yeah, she was open with me about the fact that this is the reality for her and her teammates who are scattered. They get to talk through WhatsApp, but they don't get to see each other. It's not the same. And they're lonely and they're homesick and they're struggling with depression. So
how do you handle when you are working with subjects who've been through traumatic events like this, both in terms of how you work with them and then how you also take care of yourself? These projects, and we'll talk about your book as well, are very difficult. And how do you approach that?
Well, I've worked a lot with people who have gone through some traumatic thing. And it is a really hard ask to approach someone and say, in other words, I would like to write about what you've been through. And to do that, I need you to relive the worst day of your life repeatedly. That's really a big ask. And so I try to approach them very gently. When I do approach them, I try not to do it directly, but rather through a third party who knows them, who they know and trust, and who I approach that third party first so that that person can have an opportunity to vet me before they make the choice of whether or not they want to introduce me to the actual character. So I did that with What Stands in the Storm. I did that with key characters in the Poly Class book. And I think that's important because I don't ever want to come out of out of nowhere and surprise someone, set them back on their heels. I just imagine like if it were me and someone showed up on my doorstep or just called me out of the blue, I would be kind of taken aback and it would be very disconcerting. So I start that way. And then I offer the first meeting as a off the record, no assumptions opportunity to get to know me, to let me explain what I'd like to do, what it would entail, to ask me anything. And then at the end of it, I try to give them some time to vet me, to do their homework, to ruminate on it and come to a decision they feel good about. And I often offer to introduce them to someone else I've written about in case they have questions about what is this like? What is she like? I'm worried about this. And I feel like I try to give them as much agency as possible to make a good decision. And then when they do decide to engage, if they don't, I just don't bother them again. I just back away. But if they do, I try to give them opportunities to take breaks. And I try to check in and say, like, how is this going for you? And then at the end, I read them what I've written. And I ask them, does this feel true to you? And they have an opportunity to say, this doesn't feel quite right. Or actually, it happened this other way. Or, oh, if you put that in the story, it's going to make me worry about my safety, or things that maybe haven't occurred to me. And so I think for me, it's just that agency that I try to give, and then the fact checking by reading it to them before it goes out into the world. And I think that's a very important part of my process.
And then what about yourself and your own practice of taking care of yourself in these situations?
Well, I don't always do it well. I ended up in the hospital actually the weekend that my book came out, and the doctors thought I was having a heart attack. And they ran all sorts of tests and couldn't find out why my body was acting like it was having a heart attack. It wasn't a heart attack, but what I should do and what I tried to do and what I'm trying to do now is to stay active, to exercise, to get out of the house and away from the desk and out of your head and into your body, and ideally outside in nature. So when I write, I often go on writing retreats in the mountains, and I kind of eat, sleep, and write by myself in a little cabin somewhere. But then I'll come out and snowshoe, or I'll ride my bike, or I'll go for a walk. And that really, really helps, because I think it's really easy to just sit in your chair all day, and it's not good for your mental health or your physical health. So mountain biking helps me do that. And river surfing, that's my latest one. So I've been learning how to river surf. And you can't think about anything else when you're doing that. You can't think about what you're writing, so it's good.
Is that literally what I think it is? Surfing on a river?
Yep. There is in Boise where I live, there is a man-made wave, and they're little, if you imagine the flaps on an airplane that go up and down. There are those flaps under the river, and a wave master can alter them to change the shape of a wave, and you surf on it as if the river's flowing under you, and almost like a giant treadmill. And you stay in one place and traverse this, from side to side. But it involves a lot of falling and a lot of swimming back, and it involves a lot of laps. So
that's amazing.
It's fun.
To go back what you said about this story in particular benefited from the longer narrative arc. Do you feel like that often there is a tension between the time in which you want to pitch a story because of some sort of timeliness runs into tension with, wow, I can be patient and do this, but it's harder for me to pitch at an editor level? Like, how do you navigate that tension, or is there a tension there?
There is. I'm dealing with it right now on a profile that I've been sort of pre-reporting for about a year on a longer book project that I've been working on for 7 years. And I know some of my sources are like, when are you going to write this? But for me, I feel like, oh, it's right now. It's right now. And sometimes the editor doesn't see it that way. And so I've learned to just be patient and be like, okay, sometimes the story decides when it's ready to be written. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it's not. Like, I've seen it happen again and again in my career. And you just have to trust that the story will let you know when it's time, and you can't force it. And if you try to force it, it just won't go well. And that happened with my polyclass book. I actually wrote the proposal and pitched it right after I published my first book, and it almost sold. And I got an offer, and then I decided to shop it around to other publishers. No one offered. The deal fell through. And I remember thinking, when I got the final no, I remember thinking, I should be devastated. I should be really upset. But I just feel like it's not the right time. The timing isn't right. I don't know why. And I might not have any control over that. So I'm just going to set it aside and work on other things. And then maybe one day it'll let me know when it's ready. And it did. Like, it almost grabbed me by the lapels and shook me and said, like, it's time. So I guess I just try to trust my instincts on that and listen to, if doors are opening, then, and there's momentum, then you keep going. And if doors slam shut, then I go, okay, well, maybe I need to just cool it for a little while, work on other things, and let it marinate. And yeah, it usually works out well.
So this is a good moment to talk about. The book is called In Light of All Darkness. This is kind of a non-traditional way that the book came together. Can you talk about how it came together for you?
Right. So In Light of All Darkness is an inside account of the polyclass kidnapping and child murder investigation of 1993. I hesitate to even call it a true crime book. It's shelved in that genre, and it certainly is considered that by other people. But as someone who specializes in narrative, it's not a topic I had ever really consumed or written about. And so when the opportunity presented itself to me, I wasn't sure if I should take it. And what happened was the lead FBI case agent is my father-in-law. And I've known about this case and his involvement in this for, decades. But it never occurred to me to make it into a story or a book until my husband, Eddie Jr., said, you might think about this as a book. And I was set back on my heels and I thought, ooh, I don't know. This is a dark story. Like, it ends, has a sad ending. If there isn't something really important to be learned from this, then I don't think I want to drag readers through something so intense and sad. And I started doing my homework, and I found out that this case was really pivotal in the history of the FBI in terms of there were a number of investigative tools that were tested and proven in this case. It changed some of the way the FBI structures its evidence response teams. It changed a lot of things and set a lot of precedents. And I learned that a number of the agents involved and detectives are still today using it as a teaching tool. And so I felt like it really needed to be documented in an accurate way. And I had the skills, and I also, because of the relationship, had access that no other journalist probably could have gotten. And it's a scary line to walk because, as a journalist, you're trained not to write about family members and people you know. But I realized if I didn't do it, it would be lost to history. And that something of great value would be lost. And so I felt kind of called to do it. It wasn't something that I was like, oh, this is the book I've been waiting for my whole life. It was just like, no, this is a really important book. And if I don't do it, it'll be lost to history. And so I really ought to. And I'm glad I did it, but it was very hard. And I don't think I will choose to write about true crime again.
Yeah. You write in the opening author's note very transparently about how the book came together, the connection to your father-in-law. How did that impact your access specifically to various people involved with the case and other witnesses or other people involved?
So my father-in-law introduced me to a lot of people and then stepped out of the way and let me do my job. And in most cases, he didn't sit in on interviews. He didn't look over my shoulder. I mean, he didn't really read until it was in the, advanced reader copy, like almost in publication, but just like, we have one more pass to look like, if you catch any errors. He didn't exercise any editorial oversight at all. And I was grateful because that is, of course, the risk. Once he introduced me to people, they were, for the most part, very excited to be able to tell their story that for some of them, they had never told even to family members. and they've been holding it inside and carrying it around for 30 years. And it was interesting because for some of them, it was cathartic and almost therapeutic. There was one detective who said, I've never talked to my family about this, but after talking to you, I was able to open up to them for the first time ever and talk to them about it. And it was kind of life-changing for him. He ended up like selling his house and moving to another state and, living his best life now, fly fishing stream. So I think that, I guess what I learned too is when you gain the trust of, one agent, then they often will say, well, I'm going to introduce you to three buddies of mine that really, they need to talk to you too. And often will kind of vouch for you and say, I talked to her, I trust her. It was a good experience for me. And I think even though you really don't want to talk to her, it might help you process some stuff. So that was the case for a couple of people who were originally a hard no. They came around to yes, and it took some years. And that's the other thing is that book, I think when I pitched it, there were some people that I couldn't find who were not ready to be found at that point. And there were people who weren't ready to talk. And so by the time I circled back around years later, they were ready and they were findable.
Yeah. And the book itself, you talk about early in our conversation about your focus on your ability to reconstruct scenes and going through the chapters of this book and then reviewing the endnotes. There's something like 50 pages of endnotes in this book, and it's absolutely fascinating. What is your process for putting together the piece? Are you just heavily footnoting? Is there like a tool you use?
Oh, great question. So I love talking about process and systems, and I am a big believer that for a long narrative or a book that requires sometimes tens of thousands of pages of source documents, you have to have a good system. And you gather so much information in a project like this that at some point you can't remember what you've gathered. And the act of trying to remember what you have and where it's stored takes up brain power that you really need to preserve for the actual act of writing. And so I have a system that has evolved. Every time I do a book, it evolves and changes a little bit. But I essentially have a giant spreadsheet that has a number of tabs, and each of those tabs sorts information in a different way. There's a tab that's a big to-do list. There's a tab that's my sources and characters, and I color code them. They're green if I've talked to them, yellow if I want to get in touch, red if they won't talk. I have a timeline that, for this book, the timeline was 800 lines long. And the timeline is super useful because there's a column where I have source documents. So when I am writing a scene, I go to the timeline and there's, look at this police report and this news story and this photo. And so as I'm finding things, I'm putting them there like breadcrumbs for future me so that I can find them again. And the advantage of having a spreadsheet is that I can do Control F and type in a keyword and find it really quickly. My timeline gets color-coded by either scene or theme or character, and that helps me see patterns that then inform the structure. So as I'm reporting and I have this, I also will grab the source and put it in a footnote for fact-checking. So as I'm writing, I'll just do, footnote, copy and paste. And what I've learned is with Dropbox or other cloud-based storage systems, you can create a URL for a document. So if I have a PDF of a police report, I can highlight something in the PDF and then grab the URL from where it lives on my Dropbox and drop it in the footnote. So as I'm going back through, I can click on it and boop, up pops the PDF. I go straight to the highlighted part. And then it speeds up the writing, and it speeds up fact-checking if you hire a fact-checker. So the way I did the endnotes was I went back to my footnoted document and looked at all the sources that were in that chapter, and then tried to describe some of the actual reporting and the decisions that I had to make to pull it together. And that's where I think it's super important to acknowledge sometimes eyewitnesses disagree on what they saw and how it went down, even though they were all there, and they disagree passionately and vehemently, and there's no reconciling the fact that so-and-so says this person was there, and the person they said was there, it says they were not there. And so you have to acknowledge that. And I really, really wanted the endnotes not just to be there to, legitimize the research, but to be a story worth reading about how this chapter came together. I wanted them to be useful to the historian or future researcher, but also worth reading as a story in themselves. So thank you for reading them. They almost killed me. I stayed up for three consecutive days and nights to get those out on time, and it very nearly killed me.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so valuable, for all of us, just in terms of transparency, media literacy, understanding how these narratives are put together and the work that's done to get it right as well. So you hired your own fact checker for this book?
Actually, not for this one. For this one, I appointed a couple of agents that I knew would not try to rewrite it and knew would not share it with anyone. And I've never done this before, because before I've always read my manuscripts to people that, spend a lot of time with me and have something at stake. But I knew there were a couple who had an eagle eye for detail that would be missed by a fact checker, things that are so nuanced that a fact checker wouldn't notice. For example, the term prime suspect is used by detectives, but the FBI just calls it subject. And when the FBI says subject, that means prime suspect, things like that. And this terrified me because I was afraid I would be, criticized for doing this, but I stand behind my decision and say that it did not jeopardize the editorial product. I was not forced or even asked to make any changes that would have compromised the journalistic integrity of it. It made it more accurate, but it was super scary.
Can we back all the way up here to the beginning of your career? What got you into this in the first place? And do you remember the first story you ever published?
Yeah, I think I've always loved to document. I have my first journal still, and I started writing in it in first grade. And I always kept a notebook. And when I was in high school, I liked creative writing in English, and a teacher who ran Smoke Signals, the school newspaper, noticed that I liked writing, had me write a couple stories for her, and then said, "Do you want to do an internship at the Northwest Florida Daily News?" And I said, "What's an internship?" And there was the town newspaper in Northwest Florida was next to the high school. And so she arranged an internship. I think it was my junior or senior year. And I got to go over and follow a 24-year-old reporter named Karen Wolf, who was from Long Island. And I thought she was so cool and so grown up at 24. We're still friends today. And she was on the cops beat, and she carried a police scanner in her purse. And I went with her to the courthouse and read the little police blotter back in the days before anything was digital. And I wrote 4 pieces. The first thing I ever published was a column about prom and how it was sort of really a lot more of a hassle for girls to get ready for prom than boys. And it was just, being cheeky. I did that. And then I wrote, 3 very small reported pieces in like section H. And I was hooked immediately. I was like, this is what I want to do. So I just went into J school, and I've never wanted to do anything else.
What advice do you have for other emerging journalists who are just getting started in this world?
Gosh, that's the one question that you asked that I was like, I don't know how to answer this, because it's a hard thing to get into right now. It is so hard to make a living as a journalist. And it almost feels irresponsible for me to encourage a young person to take my path, because getting into it today, even staying in it, it is so hard. I guess I would say if you can find an area that you can specialize and work in that area as well as be a journalist in that area without a conflict of interest, I think that would be really smart. If I could do it over again, I would probably have some career in like fish or fishing or food, and then I would do a lot of writing about those topics. Just even this year, I'm looking at my last quarter of my book contract, and it's going away. And I was like, what could I do? I'm writing about salmon for my next book, and I literally went down to Whole Foods and asked the fishmonger if he would hire me. I don't have any skills. And yes, it turns out that I could so I might have a part-time job as a fishmonger. But I mean, it's so sad that I feel like I've worked really hard. I'm reasonably good at what I do, but like I have to get a second career to subsidize my career. Yeah, balance what you're doing, balance your work with another job that builds you expertise and gets you into the communities that, that you want to write about. And then find a way to do it in a way that your second job doesn't compromise your journalistic integrity, but actually informs your subject matter expertise.
Yeah. Well, I think you're raising like a really great question, which is like, what does the industry look like right now in a way that people can do meaningful and thoughtful work and find a path forward? I think that's a lot of what I'm hoping some of these conversations will generate, is all of us this conversation about how to practice journalism going forward in a way that's sustainable.
Well, something needs to be done about the money situation. I work really hard. I work like 7 days a week. I got up at 5 this morning and sat down. I got up at 4 on Saturday. And I make less than probably, the 10th percentile dentist, right? And part of it is that, freelance rates haven't gone up in years. I Googled when magazines started paying $2 a word. I know some pay more, but I'd say like $2 a word is about as good as I can do right now. And that happened in 1985. And with inflation going up, it's something that I wake up and think about every day and think like, and I just want to focus on good work, but I end up having to hustle so much to just support my family. And so it's really hard. And I do think that the more volume you do, it comes at the cost of the quality of the work, or it comes at the cost of your health. Remember when I quit my job, I had a really great staff job at Southern Living, and I decided to quit to go freelance and to write a book. And I gave up a 401k. I gave up my healthcare plan. Our healthcare plan right now costs more than our mortgage. And that year, my husband had a job that would allow me to not have to earn as much. And then he lost his job. And then I, in addition to writing What Stands in a Storm, and then through the 18 months of writing and editing that, I also wrote 50 other stories and half of a second book that I don't even count.
Wow.
About Christmas. Yeah. That's a lot of volume. And it's unfortunate, but it's the reality. And as I've kind of stuck with this, I've been through freelancing for 10 years now. And the only way I can do it is through a combination of, a good book advance, ideally overlapping book advances, some great narrative projects, a little bit of teaching. And then I coach mountain biking as a way of paying myself to get away from my desk, because otherwise I feel like I can't afford to go out and ride my bike on my own because I should be sitting in my chair generating income. And that's sad,
Yeah. Does it change the equation in terms of long form narrative features versus I'm going to focus just exclusively on books? Like it's something like that. And maybe it's a different, there are a lot of people who've started newsletters essentially, or have gone into completely other mediums, or go into essentially communications or marketing as well and do independent journalism on the side. Does it change the equation on the mix of long form features versus book projects or things like that?
Yes. And I would say I'm finally figuring out this year with the book I'm working on to find long form features that can pay me to go to the place and do the research that will later end up in the book, but will also get me paid in the interim and help build my expertise and hopefully my market for the book. And so I feel like I'm getting more strategic than ever about my business model. And it includes, I'm working on a story for Food and Wine that involved a trip to Alaska to write about salmon. And for my book, I need to get down this stretch of river that's like a 500-mile stretch of river that's too big for me to paddle on my own. And I found a cruise that's Food and Wine branded and National Geographic branded, on which they have experts who talk about things. And I pitched myself and said, I will come and speak on your cruise, waive my speaker fee in exchange for passage on this date when I need to get here for my research. And you'll be helping a researcher, and I will sign a contract, but this is how I'm going to do it. And they said yes. So I'm going to be speaking on a cruise.
That's fantastic.
The better answer, though, or the more specific answer to your question is, I think that if you have a book and a book is at least a year for me, if not two or more. And then you have a handful of big narratives, and then some little short things that you can finish really quickly and have momentum. And that's one of the reasons I love writing for storyboard, is I can finish things quickly, and that gives you a sense of momentum when you finish something. Because the hard thing about these long projects is, you have to chip at them day after day after day without, sometimes it feels like you're never going to get there. So I try to build in projects of different length so that I always have something I can turn to. And it also opens the door for something I call productination or procrastivity, where sometimes you just don't feel like working on something or you're stuck. And you can always pivot and work on this other thing. And while you're sort of procrastinating on the thing you really need to do, you're still getting something done that needs to be done. And I think if you just are working on one thing, you lose that. And it's more stressful to procrastinate.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely feel that way. That the more things I have going on, the more productive I am overall, because you're constantly jumping around.
Right.
I'll just leave this broad. What other storytellers inspire you right now?
Right now, let me see. I feel like that's one of those that makes my head explode. Eli Soslow has an amazing ability to look at a really tough, complicated, big issue and then find a character-driven narrative that explores that issue through the point of view of one person who makes you see it in a really nuanced way. That's not just black and white. And I admire that so much. I love character-driven narratives, but I tend to favor things that are evergreen. I don't love news. And I think that hurts me because there's, people who hire people like me to do long stories want something newsworthy. And I often like something that is not newsworthy because it's kind of got this unlimited shelf life as a story. So I look at Eli Soslow and I go, God, he's smart about it. I wish I could be more smart. In terms of just writers and storytellers that inspire me, John McPhee has always inspired me in how he writes about science and geology, something that could be really boring, but he makes it come to life. Rachel Carson is a huge inspiration right now. Her book Under the Sea Wind and The Sense of Wonder, she writes so beautifully. She's mostly known for Silent Spring, right? Which started the environmental movement, which kind of launched the EPA. Her writing about science, she writes about science with the passion of someone who still feels the wonder of childhood. And I really admire that because I think it's hard to do both. E.O. Wilson, I loved for, I think, the same reason. He wrote about science with passion. Mary Roach, I love her footnotes. Her footnotes are laugh out loud funny. Susan Orlean is amazing. And then when it comes to fiction, Pat Conroy and Anthony Doerr and Annie Proulx are kind of my favorites.
I'd like to hear about how you have developed both on the reporting side and on the writing side, and what skills you've learned the most from.
So I'd say in reporting, radical acts of empathy, and not just listening really hard to someone who you might disagree with the intention of understanding and not arguing. I've learned to try to interrogate what I think I know about something and think about, how do I know what I think I know? How might someone else think they know something completely different? And how can both be kind of true? Both can be true at the same time, that two competing truths are not necessarily mutually exclusive, that there's so much that has to do with point of view and context. And that, I think, has helped me write scenes with stronger point of view and stronger seeing the actual world, the story world, through the eyes of a character, right? And not just feeling what they feel, but looking at it with the logic that they look at it with. So I think that, fact-checking my own assumptions has led to wonderful discoveries where, I thought I knew that, but then when it has opened doors to worlds upon worlds. And then I think patience is something that we don't always give enough credit to or for, in that again, sometimes people are not ready, and sometimes the story is not ready. And you have to respect that and back away and give it some space and some time to marinate. And I think that that's really hard, especially when you're in the hustle. And that's why having multiple things going on at once is so important. So I guess those are my two top soft skills.
Kim, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to chat.
Thank you. Oh, it's so great. You have wonderful questions.
Thank you. Thanks again to Kim Cross for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you like what we're doing with Nieman Storyboard, leave us a written review and a rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you soon.